Hey, it's Jess, and welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. I'm a social entrepreneur, speaker, mother, and business owner, and I'm here because I believe in you, and I want you to live your full potential. My mission with this podcast is simple: to offer you perspectives, tools, and inspiration to help you live with more courage, rebuild after setbacks, and strengthen yourself from the inside out. So each week, I talk to thought leaders, authors, experts, and everyday amazing people who share their stories and outlooks that help you get from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow. Let's get started. Do you ever feel like you have something great inside of you, but you just aren't sure how to bring it to life? Do you ever need some clarity on how to get from where you are to where you want to be? I'm so excited to share a free guide I created just for you. This tool has helped me in my own times of struggle and doubt. It's called Your Future Self Guide. This mini course includes a future self visualization I recorded, a series of journal questions, and some insights from me about overcoming self-doubt and embracing self-leadership. You can download it for free at jessicalindberg.com/futureself. That's jessicalindberg.com/futureself. Let's get back to the show. Hey everyone, welcome to today's Becoming Heartstrong. I am really looking forward to this conversation today. My guest is Dr. Lee Warren. He's an award-winning author, brain surgeon, patent-holding inventor, and Iraq War veteran. He's also the author of 4 books, most recently Hope is the First Dose, which we're going to talk about today. In addition to his full-time practice as a neurosurgeon, Dr. Warren hosts a podcast exploring the interplay between faith and science and unlocking the secrets of the mind, body, and spirit for better living and for helping us to make sense of faith in difficult circumstances. I came across Dr. Warren's book, I've Seen the End of You, as part of my own grief journey. In 2013, Dr. Warren's 19-year-old son, Mitch, died. And I began reading his book because I was curious about how Dr. Warren had made sense of all the grief and loss he'd witnessed as a physician and a father, and how he restored his faith, something that I was on a quest to do myself. And so today we're going to talk about faith and doubt and grief and science and how our brains and minds work and impact us as we navigate this journey. And we're going to talk about hope, which is always here in the midst of it all. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Warren. Thanks for being here.
So great to be with you, Jess. I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Yeah. So I would love to touch a little bit on your Iraq War experience. I could think it's such a grounding part. And actually, honestly, one of the reasons I was drawn to read your first book, because, I had in a very dissimilar way spent 600 nights in a hospital with my oldest son, seeing all kinds of codes and things and witnessing things that most people don't see. And my dad said to me one day, he said, it's kind of like you've experienced a war zone and now you're coming home and it's hard to integrate. I mean, I remember I'd be at Target and I'm like, am I in Target? Am I in the grocery store? Am I in Boston? Am I in, because my brain couldn't re-enter into life. And so PTSD has been something that I've been curious about. And so, I'm wondering if you can share just a little bit about that part of your story and, how you've addressed your PTSD and how, it seems to me that's somewhat foundational for the other work that you've done.
Yeah. So I was, went to medical school on a scholarship from the Air Force. And then that was in a time of peacetime. So I was, went to medical school, went to residency, did all those years while being paid by the Air Force. And then when I got done with my residency, I had to go on active duty for a few years. And again, that was in peacetime. But I got to my first assignment in August of 2001. And a month later, 9/11 happened and we were at war. And so for the rest of my time in the military, it was a wartime posture. And about 6 months before I was supposed to be done with my payback time of being in the Air Force, I got deployed to Iraq. And that was in 2005, early 2005, which was the portion of the war when the insurgency was at its peak. And there were lots of mortars and roadside bombs and all that, IEDs and all the things you heard about back then. And so I was deployed to a place called Balad Air Base, which at the time was the busiest military center in the country of Iraq. And we had Balad Air Force Theater Hospital, which was an Air Force forward hospital that was built out of tents. So I did about 200 brain surgeries in a tent hospital and survived a little over 100 mortar and rocket attacks during that time. And so, as you said, it was very grounding because I came out of this extremely controlled environment. It might surprise the listener to find out that neurosurgeons are sort of control freaks. We like to control our environments, and we like to control our outcomes and all that. And so we were deployed to an environment where you couldn't really control anything. You couldn't control whether a bomb was going to blow up the generator and the power was going to go out. So we'd be in the middle of brain surgery and the lights would go off, and had to hold still and wait for the backup generators to come on and hope that nothing bad happened in the 30 or 45 seconds that it took to get the lights back on. You couldn't control that. Couldn't control if the bomb was going to go off and kill you or you were going to survive. You couldn't control any of that stuff. And couldn't control when the helicopters were going to bring in, 20 or 30 people that had been blown up or burned up or shot. And so it just kind of slowly stripped away that sense that I had an ability to put my hands on the controls of my own life. And then the kind of the ultimate experience of that was shortly before I came home. I got caught outside. I was walking from our housing portion of the base to a little place called the BX, which is like a little mini Walmart or Target where you can go buy toothpaste and stuff like that. And I took a shortcut, and I didn't have my body armor on because it had been a couple of days since we'd had an attack. So I was just going to run over there and run back. And a mortar attack happened, and I got caught out in the open and sort of had to hide up against this little concrete wall that I could find. And for about an hour, the sirens were going off and there were lots of explosions, and nothing actually landed really close to me, but I was physically in danger and in a completely uncontrollable way that I didn't have any opportunity to do anything about. So it kind of put me in that position of being almost victim, right? Of instead of this surgeon who's in charge and makes decisions and all of that, I was sort of hoping I didn't get blown up. So I spent a lot of time praying. And at the same time in my personal life, I was going through a divorce and a lot of kind of turmoil in my life. It felt like I'd been at war for a long time before I got deployed. So I came home from the Iraq war kind of a very different person than I went to the Iraq war as. And most of that revolved around the idea of being unable to prevent certain things from happening or unable to make certain things happen when I needed to. And that sort of bubbled up in my life a few years later because I handled my deployment and all the carnage that I'd seen and all of that in probably the least healthy way that you can, which is I didn't talk about it. I literally brought a trunk full of my uniforms and stuff I'd taken out of people's bodies, shrapnel and things, and I put it in the garage, and I never opened it or talked about it. So I kind of came home and started a private practice and kind of tried to reconnect with my kids, and ultimately, put my life back together and met Lisa and got married, and all that stuff happened in the ensuing years. But I handled my time in Iraq without handling it. I just kind of shoved it down, which seems like somebody from a neuroscience background should have known better than to do. But I think we don't necessarily practice what we preach all the time. And so about 5 years after I got home from the war, I was driving one day with Lisa and at a stoplight, and all of a sudden she was shaking me. And she said that I had sat there through 3 or 4 cycles of the light. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, a helicopter went by and you just disappeared. Like you just checked out. And I started right after that having like flashbacks and memories. And I guess hearing that helicopter and seeing it must have connected some dot of something that happened in Iraq. And I basically went into kind of a full blown several month long period of time of having flashbacks and nightmares and PTSD symptoms that I didn't want to admit to myself. Ultimately spoke to a friend who was a psychiatrist and spoke to Lisa, and Lisa said, you ought to journal, and we ought to go unpack that trunk and pull all that stuff out, and you ought to tell the kids the stories, and you ought to get it out of your heart. And I was like, I don't want to do that. So then I went to talk to my friend who's a psychiatrist, and he said, what you ought to do is journal and open that trunk and do. He basically said everything Lisa had said. So I did that, and we went out and I unpacked my trunk full of stuff from the Iraq war, which turned out to be metaphorical, but also real. I literally kind of unloaded all that stuff out of my heart and out of my mind. And that's what led to me writing my first book and kind of helped me heal from the trauma.
How many years passed between coming home and unpacking that trunk?
It was 5 years. That happened in 2010. I got home in 2005. So it was a good 5 years before all that bubbled out. So it's never, you never know when it's going to come back.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's like a process, right? I remember when my son died, I was speaking with a child life therapist about my other 2 kids. I had 2 young boys at the time. And she was saying that, as your kids go through different stages of their development and their life, they're going to experience this in a different way or have different questions. And it's kind of like, these different developmental stages. And I've always remembered that you said that, because I think that I've experienced that at different stages of my life, or different, things we're going through in our family, or different, milestones for my kids. I think I have to recalibrate these experiences that we have. And I always remember that.
Right.
And so I think the message is like, there isn't a timeline, but the goal is to eventually unpack that trunk and eventually do that work. I mean, I'll just say, like, last Sunday we had to clean out the back of our basement because we're doing something with our nonprofit back there and we needed this space. And I realized a lot of stuff that was in there was from my son, Ethan, like things
Yeah.
that people, cards and pictures from his funeral and all this stuff. And we just put it in our garage. And my husband and I were like, this has been sitting here a really long time. And we just, for some reason, I think purposefully not gone there, even though we'd addressed so many other things. That's 12 years. So yeah, I mean, eventually we have to unpack that. And I think that's like, so it's proverbial and actual, right? And
Yeah.
and so once you did that, did you feel like that was kind of like opening the doorway to the possibility of some healing?
It was, and it was happening, it happened at the same time that I was in my professional practice was dealing with this common problem. Neurosurgeons deal with cancer patients all the time. There's a particular
Mm.
brain tumor called glioblastoma that I had taken care of a lot of people with. And it's basically a death sentence, right? You just don't get over it. A 5-year survival is close to zero. So I was in the midst of this kind of personal emotional crisis, PTSD issue, and dealing with a ton of these patients at the same time. And all that stuff started kind of making me question, what do I really believe? Like, I believe I'm supposed to be able to pray and God heals, and we're supposed to have faith and hold on during hard times. And I knew as a doctor how important it was to not lose hope, to encourage people to fight and have hope, and believe their life is about something, even if it's shorter than they thought it was, and all that stuff. And so it was sort of this dichotomy where I was teaching people how to handle hard things, and I was learning on my own level how to handle hard things at the very same time. And so I ended up writing about that and trying to process all of that. And that was about the same time that our son Mitch died. So we covered some of that same ground that you did with Ethan.
Did you, I mean, when you were kind of going through this, I assumed you had a foundation of faith in your life. Is that a fair
Yes.
statement prior to
Yep.
this?
Absolutely.
So
Yep.
then these things are all happening, and it's almost like we have to rediscover who God is, or meet God in a new way,
That's
because
right.
maybe some of the things that we've learned, or the stories we've told ourselves, or the beliefs that we've adopted, like, they don't add up anymore.
Yeah.
Did you have that experience? And like, could you share a little bit about when you were at that stage that you just mentioned, even just right before your son died? Like, how are you making sense of those things that were like bubbling up in you?
Yeah. So I think that no matter what kind of a good game we talk, and I think most of us who haven't been through something really hard have somehow adopted to some level a belief that our blessings in our life are tied to our performance or to God's character in some way. And so I think all of us have this sort of general sense, yeah, bad things happen to other people, but I'm really faithful, and I believe, I've got a strong faith, and nothing's bad has happened to me because God's looking out for me. I think we all sort of have some of that belief. And that's the reason I think for this problem of theodicy that happens when something bad does happen. The first question almost everybody asks is, how could God let that happen? But the truth is I was living a life where I had seen firsthand, my own brother had a son that died a few years before I went to Iraq. My experience in Iraq showed me that good kids, volunteer to do good things for their country, and they go off to war and they get blown up and they die. I've seen that, and I've seen it in my practice that good people get brain cancer and die. So I had all this evidence that bad circumstances don't mean that God doesn't love you and isn't there for you. And at the same time was living that and asking myself those questions and grasping with them. Because I think until you face it just for yourself, I think until you start having something happen in your own world or very close to you or with you yourself, I think it's not, that moves from being theoretical to being really practical, to being really real. And so for me, I was in that process of grappling with that. How do I pray? How do I tell people that prayer matters when the answer in this particular cancer is always no? Like they just don't survive. So how is it reasonable for me then to say, hey, don't give up when everybody dies? Like, the reasonable thing seems like give up because it's not gonna be okay, right? But then I started noticing that people had better outcomes in every measurable way other than how long they lived. But their marriages were better, their physical pain was better, they spent less days in the hospital. All the things you could measure about what we would call quality of life are higher in people that hold on to hope and don't give up and recognize that even if their lifespan is shortened, that doesn't mean their life is less, that their life matters less. And so I started noticing that this group of people who could go through hard things and not be sort of shattered or not die as people, even though their bodies got sicker. And then I saw other groups of people who were wrecked by having something bad happen to them. And even if they survived it, they never were okay again. They were sort of so mad that this bad thing could have happened or that they could have gone through this difficulty that even if they made it through, they were still devastated as people. So I started seeing this gap between sort of outcome and hope, or outcome and peace of mind. You have to separate circumstance from how you define the quality of your life. And that's about where I was when we lost Mitch.
Mm. You said, if you don't mind, I want to read this paragraph because it's from your book.
Sure.
It's on page 29. It really touched me. You said this, quote, "But the worst part was that every other time in my life when I felt this much pain, I could reliably talk to God about it. But this time I didn't feel like even trying." This is in reference to your son Mitch dying, because I was mad at him. And I'd been to war, and I'd seen the worst things people can do to one another. I'd been through divorce, I'd lost patience. I'd run my hands across what I thought were life's roughest textures. So I'd been around it and had my hands on it, brushed my heart up against it. But I have been wearing surgeon's gloves, and because until now I'd never felt the darkness. And I think that really touched me because it's like that idea that we can be around it and adjacent to it, but not in it. And it's such a difference. It's like such a difference when we have that
Yeah.
experience, when we take the gloves off of it in our own life and we're touching it. And when I was reading it, I was like, this guy's already been through so much. Like, how can he now like go through this? What? And I believe, as I've come to that, like, God's always writing a bigger story in our life. So I'm like, there's something, whenever the next hammer drops, I'm like, oh, there's something big here. It's
Yeah.
one way that I kind of think about it. But how, that's a deep place that you went, like, that's a dark place. And so you're going through all this, you're working through these things. This happens. Now what?
Yeah. So I just to unpack that paragraph a little bit, when I said that the idea of being mad at God, the reason I felt that way was because every time I'd gone through something hard before, I had turned to God. I had found comfort and solace in Him and believed all the promises and all that. This time, though, we'd had a little bit of teenage trouble with Mitch. You know how teenagers
Mhm.
are, they're knuckleheads. Sometimes all of us are. And we'd had a little trouble and we'd had a little strife. And he'd spent a year not gone back to college. He'd spent a year working and all of that. And we'd been praying for him, and he'd been, kind of working on our relationship with him, and there had been some strife there. And that fall, so August of 2013, we do this thing at our church in Alabama called 21 Days of Prayer at the start of school every year. And we pray for your marriages and your homes and your kids and all that stuff. And so we were right in the middle of that 21 Days of Prayer. And on the day before Mitch died, the little sermon that they have at the start of the prayer time was the youth minister from the church. And the focus of prayer that day was the children, and especially anything that was keeping the children and the parents from having a strong relationship. We were praying against that and fasting about it, and all this stuff. So we were doing this spiritual warfare. And that very day, Mitch called me and he said, "Hey, Dad, you you're right. I should have stayed in school, and I want to come home, and I'm going to come home this week." And we had this great talk. We talked for about an hour, and he had just kind of come to his senses, and he was ready to get his life back on track and all that stuff. And so it felt like God's answering these prayers, and we're doing battle and we're fighting, and he's healing the relationship, and Mitch is coming home and all that. And the last thing Mitch ever said to me was, "I love you, Dad." And the last thing I ever said to him was, "I love you too." And that very night, he was stabbed to death. And so I felt like God tricked us. It felt like a big dirty trick. Like it's all going to be okay, and then he's gone. So it just felt like this huge sort of rug pulled out from under us. And so that was the first time in my life that I ever emotionally and intellectually kind of blamed God for something that happened in my heart. Like I said, to be really honest, like it was like, why it would have felt better to not have that moment of thinking it was all going to be okay. I've since reconsidered that, by the way, in the 11 years. I'm really glad that we had that conversation. I'm so thankful that I heard his voice, and I know that, as he passed away, he knew that his dad loved him. Like he had no doubt he heard me say it, So I'm really thankful for that. But in that moment, I was so angry. And so when I talked about that, like I was feeling that metaphor, because that very day I'd been operating, and I always have this at the end of the case when you pull your gloves off and the first thing you touch after surgery, whatever it is, feels a lot more intense than what you felt when you had your gloves on, because your bare skin is handling it. And so that just came to me when I was writing that, like that's what it felt like for the first time. I felt this raw sort of dark edge to grief and pain, and what felt like the absence of God in the moment, and it just really felt forsaken and betrayed and all that stuff.
And how have you made sense of that feeling in your life? Because I think I was reading something once, and it was saying, one of the worst or hardest things as humans to get through is betrayal. It's just such a really, there's so many layers to it. And I think that's been true in my experience. And there is that sense of like, God, you betrayed me. Like I trusted you. I mean, I did all the right things, I mean, you can say, or, we had this hope, this thing happened, and now it's like we fell off the cliff. Like how you said you've since made kind of sense of that. And I'm just curious kind of how you've done that.
Well, I think the first thing is it's incredibly important to never harbor those kinds of thoughts in your heart without communicating them to somebody else. So having a community of people around you that you can say stuff to, and the Bible calls that lament, by the way, because the prayer of lament is one of shaking your fist at God, and the Bible's full of it. If it wasn't okay for us to pray that way, that stuff wouldn't be in the Bible. There's even Jeremiah, the prophet, says, "I would question you about your justice, God." Like he's telling God, I don't think your justice is right. And it's not true, but he's expressing his emotion. And so what happened is I communicated how I felt to Lisa and to my father-in-law and mother-in-law and to my friend, the chaplain, Pastor John. And I said, I feel like God's tricking us. And of course, when you say things like that, somebody else who has perspective, that's been through something hard, that's had more time in the crucible or in the furnace of suffering, then will say something like, I felt that too. And what happens is over time, you start seeing God keep promises, and you realize that he didn't betray you. He came into that moment with you, and he's there with you, and he's close to you. And so other people start to counsel you and to come alongside you to say, it's okay to feel that. But what we learn, well, I'm sure we'll talk about later in this conversation, we learn that feelings aren't facts, right? You can have a feeling about something that doesn't make it true. And the preponderance of evidence over the course of my life, and in looking at how God behaves in hard times for all people, the science leads me to say he is close to the brokenhearted. That's Psalms 34:18. He comes alongside you when you're hurting. He doesn't ever trick us or break a promise to us. He recognizes that we're hurting, and it's okay. He's big enough for us to yell at him about it. He's big enough for us to express that frustration. And what happened, it turns out, instead of being a betrayal, it turns out to have been a great blessing. Because I think if I hadn't had that conversation with Mitch that day, I would have all these questions about, why didn't you call him? Why didn't you tell him you love him one more time? Why didn't you, reach out one more time? I would have had all that question and frustration, and I would have felt like I didn't do everything I could have to make sure he knew how I felt about him. So in the grand overview, the retrospectoscope of looking back in time, I'm so thankful that we were praying and fighting for him, because I know I took every ounce of fight I had in that situation to him and to God, and that Mitch's heart was turned back towards his family before he died. And I have all that comfort now. And so it wasn't a betrayal. It was actually a answered prayer. It just felt bad in the moment. And that's a really good lesson for all of us. A lot of things feel a certain way, don't turn out to be that way.
You mentioned Pastor John, who you wrote about in the book, and you just mentioned him now. And he said something to you. You guys had a conversation one day, and he said that we can make idols of our pain. And he goes on to talk about that. And Pastor John had two children die, if I'm correct, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly. And I just thought that was really powerful because I think a lot of people make an idol of their pain. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I've done that at times in my life, right?
Yeah.
And I think I think people get stuck there. I see so many people that I see, and even like, so I have a son that's fully disabled, at this point too, my youngest son. And so I'm in a lot of different communities of mothers, and and people have heard me say this before, but I think a lot of times like mothers become the identity of their sick child. Like
Yeah.
it becomes like, oh, I'm this, or if someone has cancer, it's like I'm a cancer patient. But like that's not really our identity, but we tend to make an idol of that, of out of that place, and we live there. And I thought that was like such a powerful statement. Like, what do you see in that? And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, because I think that's a like pivotal thing to think about as we're thinking about our pain.
Yeah, and I think it's funny how the more I learn about how our minds and our brains work, and the more I learn about the way the universe really works, it's interesting that neuroscience backs this idea up. Like the more you pay attention to something, and the more you focus on something, and the more you attend to that thing, it becomes more real in your life. And so that's what we're seeing with a lot of people that are getting more and more therapy and having more and more anxiety. They're spending more and more time focusing on something that happened in the past, our trauma or our problem or whatever, and it becomes harder and harder to heal from it. So what we've learned is the same thing that happened to me with grief with Mitch, and I think with a lot of us that John was warning about, is that when you focus on something, it becomes bigger in your mind. Your brain has a filtering mechanism in the reticular activating system of your brain that filters out the stuff that you tell it not to pay attention to and magnifies the things that you tell it to focus on. So the more you focus, let me just take a quick aside and say
Yeah.
this is not the stuff that you do the day after your child dies. Okay.
Right.
That's
Right.
appropriate grief. I'm talking about as time passes and your heart is telling you, your family's telling you, and life is telling you that it's time to begin to heal. There's a group of us that don't move forward, that don't start to heal. We stay stuck, and we develop what's called complex grief, and we can stay in this ruminating cycle. And what happens, those people is what I'm specifically talking to. This isn't the work that you need to be doing the day after, the month after, however long, right after. Jess and I will agree. There's a process that must be gone through in grief, and so please don't hear me saying that. But there comes a time when you become aware that it's been too long and your life isn't progressing the way it's supposed to. And a lot of times that's happening because you have developed this reverberating circuit of focusing on the thing that happened to you. And that thing starts to become so big that you can't see anything but that in your life. And that's when you start to accept this identity. I'm going to be a bereaved parent. I'm going to be stuck in this. I'm never going to get over this. My family's going to move on and I'm going to stay behind. And that's when you start having marital problems. And that's when you start having trouble with your other children. And you see kids acting out because the parents are stuck and the kids are still growing up and they need attention. And all that stuff happens. And it also happens in our relationship with God. When the pain becomes the defining characteristic of our life, it begins to determine how we make decisions about our life, what we're going to do, how we're going to medicate, how we're going to spend our time, how it's going to affect the people that we choose to spend time around. That becomes the biggest thing you can see. And a very simple definition of idolatry or of an idol is anything that's bigger to you than God is, or the thing that you spend the most amount of your time, treasure, talent, and emotional energy focusing on is an idol. And that can become your God. There's a scripture in Isaiah that says that I have refined you in the furnace of suffering. And that when I saw that scripture, I realized like if you're in a furnace and you're silver and you get boiled, it boils away all the impurities and all the bad stuff, and you come out more pure than you were. But you can also be burned up and destroyed by the furnace. And so the fire can either cleanse you and refine you, or it can define and destroy you. And I think that's what happens with grief, that grief can either become the thing that identifies you and it will progressively destroy the rest of your life, or it can be a clarifying and refining process that then informs the rest of your life, but doesn't define it. And so for me, that's that junction between idolatry and proper healing.
Say that one more time, because that was really good. It can inform your life, but not define your life. Just say that again for people again, because I think that was really key.
Yeah, I think it's this defining thing that can become the biggest, most powerful formulating thing, or it can inform the rest of your life, but not become your identity, right? It can become the thing that happened to you that maybe changed the arc of your life. Maybe it changed your career. Maybe it changed what you thought was important or what you're there for. Like you weren't a nonprofit person doing a podcast and trying to help other people find hope again and resilient hearts again after grief before that happened. You decided that you were going to make something that Ethan would have been honored by, that make it matter. So you're not torn up and lost by it all forever. You're torn up and made better by it, torn up and reformed into something better, right? And so I think for me, it was, and me and Lisa and our family, it was like, we have to be people who can then grow out of this and turn around and reach our hand back and give somebody else something to hold on to and pull forward in a way that honors Mitch and he would be proud of. Because I know if what we believe is true, that our people that we lose are in heaven waiting for us and we get to reunite with them someday, if that hope is true, then they're not up there crying over the fact that they died. They're up there rooting for us to get to be with them someday. And they want us. I'm sure your son looks down and says, "Good job, mom and dad. That's good stuff you're doing. You're helping people. I'm proud of you." Like that's what Hebrews talks about, the great cloud of witnesses. There are people up there that are saying, "Hey, we see things really clearly now, and you're on the right path. We're rooting for you." And so your loss doesn't have to define you in a destroying way, but it can refine you in a clarifying way that can give you purpose and meaning. And that's what Viktor Frankl was talking about after the concentration camp experience. He said, suffering is sort of optional in a sense that you can go through something really hard, but it stops being suffering when you give it purpose. When you recognize that it has a purpose that's doing something in your life that's going to help you become a better person or achieve something or find a new path that you wouldn't have taken otherwise, honor God in some way with your life, then it has a purpose to it. And it's not just meaningless suffering.
And I think every human desires that purposefulness, because I think that is the path to healing and to growth. And I think, frankly, that's why we're here. I think
That's
suffering
right.
is a part of being a human. Hey there, it's Jess, and we're taking a brief pause to highlight this show's sponsor, the Heartstrong Collective. It's more than just a nonprofit. It's a social movement I founded to inspire people worldwide to embody resilience and grow through challenges. Through the Heartstrong Collective, we're dedicated to empowering caregiving families, investing in the next generation, and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. To learn more about our mission and how you can get involved, visit us at theheartstrong.com. And I want to get into this idea of changing our minds, changing our lives, because I think that's what I love about your message is that you share all of these things, but then you're giving people really practical tools about how they can shift. And I think people are desperate for that. You like to call you call it the TMT, the massive thing that happens. I loved that little acronym. Everybody has those. We all have those in different times. And I also like to tell people too, and I had a conversation with someone this week, like maybe your TMT today is not the same thing as something that we're talking about. Maybe it's something and you're like, well, it's not as big of a deal. I've had people say that to me. Well, I'm not trying to compare, but I say, no, there isn't a comparison in suffering or sadness or grief. Like we all experience different things in our life. So this is for everyone. Right. This is for anyone listening who's going through something challenging today or tomorrow, or this is for somebody who feel like they haven't had something yet. These are tools that are so valuable for all of us. And so I want to get into talking about our brains and our minds and how they're different things. And I'm wondering if you can explain that to us, because I think that's our brains are so powerful, and I struggle with this. I mean, I've learned a lot from you in all of this too. And it's like, so tell us about why we're not our brain and how our minds and our brains are different.
Yeah. So this is interesting. Neuroscience up until about 2004. So I'm older than you, but I trained in an era in the 90s when we were taught and we taught that you're born with pretty much the whole brain that you're ever going to have, and you better take care of it. As you bump your head, you kill brain cells, you get dumber, right? And as you get older, if you drink too much alcohol, you're going to get dementia and all this stuff. And so we had this idea that the brain, of all the organs in the body, the brain was the only one that couldn't regenerate itself. It couldn't really heal itself. You're stuck with it. And at the same time, since 1953, when Watson and Crick taught us about DNA, there's been this popular cultural idea, and it's gotten really popular in the media, and it's been taught to us in public schools, that our genes kind of define what's going to happen to us in our life. And you'll hear people say things like, well, I can't help that. I got that from my parents. I'm going to be that way. I'm a hothead. I'm anxious, or I'm depressed, or I'm angry, or whatever, because of the genes that I inherited. And I can't really do anything about it. So we've accepted two ideas. Number one, that our brains are fixed and can't really change, and there's nothing we can do about it. And number two, that our genes determine who we are and what's going to happen to us. So that led to, and I'm not going to try to nerd out too much here, but that led to a doctrine that's really taught called determinism, which basically means if you can reduce a person down to their component parts, you figure out what the brain is made out of, and it turns out to be made out of cells called neurons, right? Then once you understand how a neuron works, then you can reverse engineer somebody's whole life, and you can figure out what they're going to be about, how they're going to think, and how they're going to react in certain circumstances. And you can determine what's going to happen in your life based on what you can be reduced to, the parts that you're made out of, right? Mm-hmm. And all of us, even if we haven't really thought about that, all of us have to some degree or another accepted that idea that certain things in our life are what they are. I'm born in a particular family with a particular set of cultural values and habits, and religion or not religion, in a certain culture with a set of genes. And then I go through life and I have certain traumas or tragedies or things that happen that break me in certain ways. And I'm just kind of stuck with that. And that's relevant to us in this conversation when we find out that in the 21st century, they invented functional brain imaging, and they can now look at what happens in your brain when you change the things that you think about. And it turns out that none of that stuff is actually true. That what's true is that when you think differently, your brain changes how it acts. And when it changes how it acts, it changes how the neurotransmitters are produced. It changes the levels of hormones. It changes how your body responds to the things that you think about. And so on one stream, it turns out that brain doesn't create this idea that you have a mind, and that everything about you and your whole life is just the product of neuronal activity. It turns out to be the opposite of that your mind is in control of your brain. And so the things that you think about determine how your brain behaves. So that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. Then we learned the science of epigenetics was discovered, which means epigenetics isn't that you can change what genes you have, but it's that you have a tremendous amount of control over how those genes are switched on and switched off. And so what that means is you can't do anything about the genes that mom and dad gave you. That is true. But what's not true is that if your mom and dad gave you the starting point of having stress hormonal levels that were a certain place, or certain ways that you respond to trauma, you can actually change that by changing how you think. And when you do, genes get switched on and off, and those can be passed on to your children, which means that you can give your kids a better starting point in how they handle stress, for example, how their brains respond to violence or fear or anxiety or any of those things, because you taught them epigenetically how to switch certain genes on and off at birth. So all of that to say this, what we learned is that science wasn't actually as smart as we thought it was, that your brain is not in charge of you, your mind is in charge of your brain. And that's why I call it self-brain surgery. This idea that when I go to the operating room and I shave your head and I cut your scalp open and open your skull up and put a knife in your brain for the purpose of doing something structural to your brain, that's exactly the same set of things that happen when you change the way you think about something, because you actually are making new neurons every day, and you are making new connections. They're called synapses between those neurons all the time. Synapses that you've had that have automated behaviors or thoughts or feelings or patterns of activity that you've had your whole life, or since this massive thing happened to you, those can be changed almost instantly in a structural way that's every bit as real as what I can change in the operating room of surgery. And so what that means is it's not some kind of motivational self-help hack. It's not just some way to think differently. It's not just some therapy technique. It's actually true that if you can assume the responsibility for it and be willing to do the work, you can learn a set of techniques to structurally make your brain work for you instead of against you. And that means you can then prepare yourself for these hard things. Like you just said, not everybody lost a child. Not everybody's developed a brain tumor. Not everybody's husband cheated on them, or not everybody's lost their business or whatever. But all of us are going to have some of that kind of stuff happen, or all of us are going to lose somebody eventually, or all of us are going to go through a bunch of little things that stack up to be big things in our life over time. And since we know that stuff is coming, even if we haven't already gone through it, then it makes sense to develop a treatment plan, to sort of develop a strategy or a set of surgical tools or strategies, if you will, to be prepared for those things so that we know that we will be able to have the resilience and strength and stamina that we need when those hard times come. And so if you then accept the idea that you don't have to be the victim of your thinking anymore, that you don't have to be the victim of your emotions anymore, that you don't have to be the victim of what your uncle did to you when you were 9 anymore, that you can actually take charge of that and retrain your brain to behave in a better way. Then you go from this sort of victim place to being empowered, to being in charge of some of those responses instead of reacting to them all the time. And that's when you start building this hope that you can actually overcome just about anything you go through in your life.
Wow, that's so powerful. I want to talk practically about this, but I want to go back for 1 second because you just mentioned that when we think differently, our brain actually operates differently. And you
Yeah.
highlighted that in the book. And you talked about the MRI that you were watching and where the woman was like, raise your right hand and then think of something happy. Will you share that? Because that to me was just so powerful because it was like evidence for what we're talking about.
Yeah, so you can put somebody in a functional MRI scanner. Lisa and I did it. It was shortly after we went back to work after Mitch died. And this is really, I think, the day that made the biggest difference for me is I'm thinking that I'm broken by this event and I'm never going to be able to recover from it. And, I'm just devastated and I don't know what the future is going to hold. And then we're down in the first floor of this MRI research center at our workplace. Our office was on the campus of Auburn University, and they had this fancy MRI scanner that could do these things we're talking about, and they were running some experiments, and they had people in the scanner, and they would say, okay, think about the worst day of your life. Like, think about the day you found out about Ethan. Think about the phone call that you got when you found out that your mom had passed away, or whatever it was, the worst thing that you've been through. And in real time on the screen of the scanner, you could see the blood flow changes and the metabolic activity in different areas of the brain light up. And you can see what's happening inside the brain in response to what a person's mental activity is doing. So I'm thinking about this thing and my brain is doing that thing, right? So mind is triggering events in brain. And then they would say, okay, now stop thinking about that for a second. I think about the best thing that's ever, the day your child was born, the day your husband went down on one knee and proposed to you, whatever the best moment of your whole life was. And all of a sudden the screen lights up in all these different areas. Colors change, blood flow patterns change, metabolic activity in different parts of the brain is lighting up. And you're seeing in real time the product of somebody changing from thinking about this to thinking about that and what that's doing structurally inside the brain. And so when the brain is doing something different metabolically, that means that genes are getting switched on and off, that different proteins are getting synthesized, that different synapses are getting severed and repurposed to other places, that different networks of neurons and neural activity is firing in different ways, which produces then different hormones being released in your glands and different physiological things happening in your body. And so we could see it with our own eyes, Jess, that what you think about turns into real things in your body. And so that means that I always say it this way. It sounds kind of corny, but you change your mind and you'll change your life, because your brain determines what your body does. Your body determines how your life plays out. And all of that is under the subservience and the guiding influence of what you think about. So that's where it started with us, was seeing it with our own eyes.
It's incredible. And I wonder, they say there's always this like the body keeps the score. I'm sure you've heard of that book.
Yep.
It makes me wonder about, is it really the brain that makes the body keep the score? Like what's that is it bi-directional, that relationship, or is it, I mean, I've read a lot of things about the heart brain connection, which I'm very interested in as well, but Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when we have trauma, I mean, you talked about you had a shoulder that was always
Yeah.
hurting you physically. I also have had some physical things that I've dealt with over the years. And I do think it's energy, sadness, stress living in my body. Did like how does that work together and how
Yeah.
can we release our bodies by changing our minds
Right.
maybe?
So we're learning actually for the last year and a half, I think, since I actually published that book, Hope is the First Dose, I've actually learned more than I knew at the time that I wrote it. And I wrote a lot about, you're referring to this pain that I have in my right scapula
Mhm.
that happened a few days after Mitch died. I got shingles in my right shoulder, which I thought shingles are for old people. And I was 40 years old. But you get shingles, I know now, when you're under times of extreme stress or emotional duress, you're likely to have shingles attacks. And I did, my right shoulder. And then I developed something called post-herpetic neuralgia. So the shingles virus is a herpes virus, not the sexually transmitted
Mhm.
disease one, but the one that causes chickenpox, the same virus. And so that virus lives in nerve endings, and it has a tendency to fire back up later in your life and cause repetitive pain syndromes. And so I now know that I can trigger that if I let myself go down a certain path of thinking about what I was feeling and what was happening when Mitch died, and the loss and the pain and all of that. I can reliably get that pain to show back up in my shoulder. And so that's kind of the genesis of this book, like The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk's idea that people have this idea that trauma lives in the body. But what's really true, what's actually happening is not that my shoulder is storing memories of that traumatic event. That's not really what's happening, because you don't actually feel pain in your body. You feel it in a brain mapped area in your brain. So
Mhm.
the sensory nerves transmit up to the brain, not down from the brain. So when you think about something that's hurting, you're actually processing that in your brain. So the memory is what you're feeling. So for me, I've got this connection between an injury in my shoulder that was caused by a virus that happened in response to the stress, right? And a time in my life when that happened that was associated with extreme emotional duress for me. And so now when I re-trigger those memories, or when something environmentally triggers those memories, my body calls up all the stuff that was relevant. My brain and mind and body call up all the stuff that was relevant in the first time I experienced that feeling. And I feel it in my shoulder. It's
Mhm.
not stored there. It's happening because that's part of a memory circuit that I've attached meaning to. And that's good news for us. Okay. It's really good news. If you're listening and you've got some kind of trauma in your past, and you're having some kind of physical symptom associated with that, the good news is you can't change anything about the trauma that happened. I can't bring my son back. You can't bring your son back. You can't undo the trauma. And if it was true that trauma causes structural changes in our bodies that produce irreparable pain syndromes that we can't bring back, that would be really hopeless. If trauma was the thing that broke us, then we couldn't do anything about it, and it would be kind of hopeless. But the truth is, trauma response and pain that we feel in terms of it, and memories and all these things that happen to us, are related to how we processed that trauma and what we have stored in our memory that we refire as a program when we experience that thought and feeling again. And that's really good news, because if you have a trauma response that's not serving you well, you can learn a different response. And that's why this idea that your brain being under the control of your mind is so hopeful and so powerful, because you can train yourself into a different type of response that will then lead to healing. And those old patterns do not have to perpetuate, and they do not have to define the rest of your life. You can change them.
Can we pick like a thought process that maybe people have or maybe one that you've had, and can you walk us through this idea? So like if someone's listening and they're like, I want to try this in my day or in my life, they can do it.
Yeah. There's a procedure. Again, I'm sorry if it seems corny, but I'm a brain surgeon. So I view things kind of metaphorically in surgical terms. And I've already told you, like, this structural stuff that's happening in your brain really is just like surgery. I mean, you're doing things that change the structure of your brain. So that's the definition of a surgical procedure. So
Right.
I always think about this thing that we call the thought biopsy. So if you came into my office and you said, "Hey, I've been having headaches. Okay, I've been having these headaches, doc, and I'm worried about them." And if I just said, "Okay, Jess, let's go to the operating room and I'll cut your head open and look around and see if I can find something. Right? You would say, wait a second. Don't we need to do a scan, or don't we need to get some data before we go off to the operating room? You start doing surgery. Don't we need some information here? Don't we need some diagnostic material? Right? You would be right? I haven't done an MRI. I don't know if you've got a brain tumor or not. I don't know where it might be, but I'm just going to go operate, or I'm going to go just start doing stuff that might be irrevocable or cause you some harm. That wouldn't be the right move. That'd be malpractice, right? So what we often do in our lives, though, is we feel something or we think something, and we immediately decide that it's true and needs to be reacted to, and we start reacting. And we don't take a second to decide if that's real or not, to decide if it's true or not, or to decide if it's going to help us to respond to it in a particular way or not. And so I have this idea of thinking about what I actually do in the operating room. So I would say to you, you got headaches, let's get an MRI, and the MRI shows a spot. Well, we're not sure what that spot is, but it might be cancer or it might not be cancer. So before we radiate your brain, let's just put a little tiny biopsy needle in there and let's take a piece of that tissue. And let's take a second to look at it with the pathologist and examine it and run a bunch of tests on it. And let's define what the problem really is before we start treating it, right? And so you can do that in your mind by learning to just place a little pause in between the stimulus of what you're thinking or feeling and your reaction to it. And the problem is the brain is really good at automating things. In fact, one of the whole functions of your brain is to automate things that you have to do frequently and turn them into things that you don't have to think and use mental energy to deal with. And a good example of that is if you moved took a new job next week and Monday was your first day, it was in a different part of town than your old job was. On the drive there that first day, you would have to pay attention to every turn and every stoplight and watch out for where's the crosswalks and where are the school zones and all that stuff. You'd spend a lot of mental energy processing that drive to work. But after 4 or 5 days, all of a sudden you'd realize I listened to music, I talked on the phone, and I'm just showed up at work. I never even thought about the drive, right? Because your brain has automated all that stuff, the turns, the twists, the school zones, the speed ups, the slow downs, the places where there's construction. Your brain turns that into a process that you no longer have to spend mental energy thinking about. Okay. And we've done the same thing with our trauma responses. We've done the same things with the way that we react to stress. We automate our process without putting a pause in there to think about it. And so if you can define this idea in your mind of, I want to learn how to put a little space in there, put a biopsy needle into that thought and say, is it true? Is it necessary for me to think about this right now? Is it helpful or compassionate, or might it be harmful if I respond to this in some way? Like put some tests in there, like we would do in the lab, looking at the tissue with the pathologist. And it doesn't take very long. And the more you practice it, it becomes a habit that you get really good at, that something challenges me, something pops up into my mind, something makes me feel like I'm going to go down that path into grief or despair again. And before I even react to it now, I say, wait, is that true? Is that thought real? Do I need to respond to that right now? Is it going to help me? Is it compassionate to myself? Is it helpful to my family if I respond to that in that way? And before you know it, you've built this practice in your life that has become a tool for you that keeps you from going into those harmful responses. And one of those responses, frankly, is that sometimes we feel a certain thing at the end of the day and we find ourselves half a bottle of wine into the evening because we're turning our brain off because we don't want to feel it, right? And we don't even remember getting the corkscrew out and opening that bottle, and now we've had 3 glasses of wine, right? Because that's a trauma response. That's a response that you've allowed yourself to develop so you don't have to feel the thing that you don't want to feel or process it. And the problem with that, of course, as we all know, is the next day you still got to deal with it, and now you got another problem to deal with. You
don't feel so good. Yeah.
You don't feel great, right? Yeah. So the point is then build some systems in your life. And if it's for you, if it's wine or whatever it is, put a note on top of your corkscrew that says, biopsy that thought before you drink this wine. Like process it, do the work, like think about this thing before you engage in the typical response to it. If it's, you typically get on Amazon and do a bunch of one-click shopping and make yourself feel better because you bought a bunch of stuff, or you turn on Netflix and you zone out and you don't talk to your spouse for 3 hours because you're just letting yourself go down some mental, embalming process of not having to think about something. Put some kind of physical block in your life that will remind you to biopsy the thought and decide how you're going to respond to it instead of running that automated program. And I promise you, it will start setting you free in your life.
Mm, that's so good. One of the things the thoughts that I have struggled with in my life through this process. So my son Ethan died 2 years after he died. My son Bodie was born 1 year after he was born. He was diagnosed with a rare disease that's been a really challenging situation. And, and that's just the things that you say, right? Our all lives all have little things with relationships and jobs and all the things that we all go through. And I would have this thing that I would tell myself, good things don't happen for me. And it
Right.
just became, because I had all this evidence, if you will, in my life that good things don't happen for me. And I did something wrong as a mom because I have unhealthy kids, so these are like ideas that they almost were default. Like I wasn't consciously noticing that they were there. And so I've really had to like identify that they're there. And I know that good things happen for me, and I do believe, but it's like I've had to retrain that. So is the retraining to say the opposite thing is true, or like, and then how do you get to believe that? And that's one of my
Right.
questions. Like, so if you
Well,
have this thought, this recurring thought, how do you shift it into a positive thought?
Well, let's be very careful to say the research is really clear that it's better to have fewer negative thoughts than it is to have untrue positive thoughts. And that sounds like we're saying the
Oh,
same
that's
thing in
good.
two different ways. So it's not. Negative thinking is always harmful to you because it blocks you from finding solutions or finding a path forward. So just learning how to tone down the always, never, this won't ever be okay, all that kind of stuff, because there is always something you can do about the situation. That's not the
Right.
same as saying just be happy, find a positive, find some way to spin it positively. It's not the same thing. So
Okay.
it's important to say realistic thinking is crucial, and you should have a positivity bias towards your I'm going to find a way through this. Other people have found a way through this. There's a path forward. God's not going to abandon me. All that stuff is true. But in practical terms, what you're saying is not to just force yourself to sort of believe the opposite thing is true, but to rather say, is this thing that I'm feeling, is it actually true right now? Is it true that I'm not a good mom, that I'm not capable of navigating this situation with my child? Is that 100% true? And
Mhm.
then allow yourself to look at, what if it's not 100% true? Then what are some ways that I could navigate making it more true, or making it less true if it's negative, or making the other thing more true? What are some things I could do? What's a little thing, a step I could take to prove to myself, an objective piece of data, that I'm not a bad mother, that I
Mhm.
do have an opportunity to help my child? So you start thinking, okay, is it 100% true? Nothing's ever almost 100% true, right? These negative thoughts that we have. So since I can't make that thought just necessarily disappear because your brain keeps throwing it at you, then say, okay, when I feel this, I'm going to question it. I'm going to interrogate it. I'm going to look for opportunities to find cracks in its foundation and say, well, this isn't true. I'm a pretty good mom. I have evidence that I've made good decisions, and my kids are all, safe, and they're not starving to death. And I can build a case for why I'm going to turn out to be a good parent after all. And so you start attacking the foundation of the thing that isn't true and looking for opportunities to grab something that might be true and make it more true with positive actions, positive steps towards that better reality.
And then over time you build evidence, which then you can believe
That's
in
right.
that positive.
That's right.
Yeah. That's I think that's I've done a lot of work with grieving families and families of kids that have had a lot of challenges, and I think that this right here that you have is gold, and I think that it's something that people need. It's hopeful and it's practical and it's something
Yeah.
that we can all do. I think the challenge with a lot of times with grief and all this stuff is that, or even trauma, it's that we need, we got to sign up for this thing and that thing, and we need these many doctors, and it's overwhelming to people because it feels like they don't know where to turn, when the
That's
reality
right.
is we have it right inside of us. And I think that's what is really powerful about what you
That's right.
are sharing, is like the same, it's like God's given us the tools that we need to get through and overcome the things that we experience. I think that's really interesting.
That's right. Well, and that's the really the bottom line message for everybody here, is that you already have all the tools that you need in your nervous system. Your nervous system is designed to run the plays that your mind tells it to run, to make the structural changes it needs to make, to focus on the things you tell it to focus on. And so if you can truly divorce yourself from any belief that your brain is the boss of you, that you're determined by your genes and by how your brain is functioning, if you can truly believe that the modern neuroscience, scripture for thousands of years have been saying it, but modern neuroscience and modern quantum physics have proved it, that your mind can make your brain do what it needs to do. And you already have that inside you. All you need is the training and a commitment to the practice, and you'll be okay.
So can I ask you about, there's manifestation and all these things are kind of like trendy and people feel like they can create something from nothing. It's an interesting idea since you're talking about the brain. How does that manifest into our circumstances and even into, I'm going to go one step further, even into, let's just say you're sick and and I've heard people say, I've have, a neighbor that's had cancer and she's doing amazing and she's changed her mind around about a lot of things and it's really impacted her physically. Can you talk a little bit about those pieces? Because I think they're culturally relevant and people hear about them. What are those connections like?
Yeah, so we have to be careful when we talk about these things. People use the term manifestation and they often mean it in some sort of magic trick type way where if you just change how you think, you can attract, infinite money and love, and you'll be more beautiful and everybody will respect you and all your problems will go away. And that's just that's not true. It's not the case. What's true is this, we mentioned a minute ago, this thing in your brain called the reticular activating system. Your reticular activating system is a set of filters that is basically waiting all the time for your mind to tell it what to focus on in a given moment. And so the classic experiment is they show these people a photograph, and they say, look at this photograph for a minute, and then close your eyes for a few seconds. And they'll close their eyes and they'll say, let me back up. Look at the photograph and count how many yellow things you see in the picture. How many yellow things do you notice in this picture? And they'll close their eyes and think about it for a second after they've looked at the photograph. And they'll say, okay, how many yellow things did you see? And they'll reliably be able to tell how many yellow things were in the photograph. And then they'll show them a different picture and say, how many blue things do you see? And focus on the blue things and count the blue things, and then close your eyes. And then they'll say, okay, how many yellow things did you see in that picture? And they won't see any. And they'll say, wait, you told us to focus on the blue things. And they'll show them the picture again. And there's like hundreds more yellow things than there were blue things, but they were focusing on blue that time and they only saw blue. And that's your reticular activating system. What your reticular activating system does is it focuses on the things you tell it to focus on and basically blinds you to everything else, which means you can wake up in the morning and you say, this is going to be a lousy day. I'm going to have the worst day of my life today. And guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a lousy day because your brain's not going to see anything that is true that doesn't validate your important filtering job that you gave it of looking for things that are lousy. Okay. So where that comes into this manifestation idea is that people start saying, okay, today's the day. I'm going to come into some money, right? I'm going to find some money today. And then on the way to work, they look and lo and behold, there's a nickel on the ground. They notice a nickel and they pick it up and say, look, it's working. I found some money. And then they start hyper focusing on every opportunity they have. And they realize, oh, there's a client I can call over here and I'm going to make a sale. And it happens. They make a sale. And then all these other things happen. And by the end of the day, they've increased their business success a little bit. And then they start to believe that they have manifested that result through some kind of miracle of the universe responding to their thinking. But what they've really done is they've told their brain, you look out for evidence that you can be successful and you'll start finding it. And the truth is, the day before, that nickel was already on the ground. You just weren't looking for it yet, right? And that guy was in your Rolodex and you were supposed to call him 3 weeks ago and you didn't. And that business was always on the table for you and you just needed to make that call, right? So you were filtering things that weren't making you able to see the possibility that was there. And that's what happens to us in grief sometimes, is we start filtering out the things that are still hopeful. We start filtering out the things that are still light. The fact that our other kids love us and need us and our spouse is still with us and all that. And we start only being able to see the things that are reinforcing the idea that it's never going to be better than this, or it's never going to be okay. And then over time that starts to build up in our hearts that look at this reality that's happened because of this thing that occurred. And now inevitable. And now I'm going to start making decisions around that. And I'm going to start deciding that since my life is this way, then I need to drink more, or I need to, I need to get a divorce because maybe my new spouse will make me happier than this one has because it's not working out for me. And so the idea of manifestation then is the trick that you play on yourself in believing that you're making certain things happen when they were already there and it was already possible. You just weren't looking from the right perspective at those things. And that can be positive or negative. So I think that's the way I would look at that. Like your nervous system is incredibly powerful at being able to do what you tell it to do and look for what you tell it to find important.
I think that's really fascinating, and it's just more evidence that we have the tools we need to do the work that we're here to do as humans.
Right.
I think that's really, really interesting. A couple things I want to ask you about before we close. I think you kind of talked about it somewhat in this, but I want to get a little bit more specific on like neuroplasticity and faith.
Yeah.
And how our brain, I mean, we've obviously talked about the neuroplastic brain through this whole conversation. But you talk a lot about, you say you talk about the intersection of neuroscience and our brains and faith. And I think sometimes people think that they're opposite, or, that science and faith can't go together. And you posted something on your Instagram the other day where you initially it doesn't go together, but if you keep peeling off the layers and asking the questions in science, it always leads back to faith, or always leads back to God. And I think there's arguments that people will say, well, I believe in science, or there's that whole thing. I'm not, there's no evidence of faith. In your life as a surgeon, as a person who looks in people's brains, as a father, as a veteran, where is that intersection for you, and what would you say to someone who's wondering if those two things fit together?
Well, I think it is two questions. I mean, as an individual human, I was raised by people who were Bible believers, Bible believing Christians, and I was taught to find the answers to the problems of life in the Scripture. And then I was a kid who was bent towards science academically, and those two things seemed sort of contradictory to one another. And so I had this sort of dichotomy, this sort of cognitive dissonance as I went through my training in school, where I believed a bunch of stuff and I was learning all about science, and all the people that I was working around didn't believe any of the stuff that I thought I believed in this world. So I just kind of kept them separate. And I think a lot of people who are in medicine and science and all that just sort of do that. We don't ever mentally try to figure out where the two things work together. We have belief and we have data, and we just try not to mix them up too much, right? And we don't get too embroiled in the underpinnings of it. But then when life starts getting hard, and it starts raising questions of, is this stuff that I believe over here really true? And is it compatible with what I think? Or are we just in this cold, sort of meaningless universe that the evolutionary biologists want us to believe we're in? And what I started realizing is it's in the realm of quantum physics is where science and faith really start coming together in a way that makes sense. And we don't have time to unpack all of that. But what I'm getting at is that quantum physics in the early part of the 20th century was the first time that science, in a reliable, mathematically provable way, kind of showed that Isaac Newton was a little bit off when Newton thought that the whole universe could be boiled down to the activity of atoms. And once you understood atoms, then you could determine everything, like we talked about earlier, determinism. Quantum physics came along, and guys like Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg said, wait a minute, when we observe an experiment in a particular way, we get one result. And then when we change our perspective and observe the experiment from a different perspective, we get a different result from the same perspective. And they kept running that experiment. And the famous one is the light experiment. Is light a photon or is it a wave? And you can design an experiment to try to prove that light behaves like a particle or a photon. And the results will always prove that light behaves like a particle or a photon. And then you can say, well, wait, I think light behaves like a wave, like it's doing this instead of this. And if you design your experiment to test out whether or not light behaves like a wave, it always behaves like a wave. Mm. And there's this famous double slit experiment. If somebody's interested, they can Google that, the double slit experiment. And it basically is true. How you observe the experiment changes the result of the experiment. Mm. And so the quantum physicists figured out, wait a minute, there's an impact on the universe that is created by the mental force of the observer of the universe. that you're observing the experiment, but you're affecting the outcome of the experiment at the same time, because what you think about changes the quantum field of the universe around you. And so that's really nerdy, and it's a high level way to say this, but the bottom line is what the Bible said a long time ago is that when you transform your thinking, your life changes. That if you want to be less anxious, think about different things. And so now that we know that anxiety carries a whole host of physiological connotations, right? Your heart changes and your gut changes and all the things happen in your body when you're anxious. And now that we know with functional brain imaging that you can change what you're thinking about, and your brain will change from an anxious posture to a hopeful and grateful posture, and that produces physiological changes in your body, then it turns out to be true that those guys wearing sandals 2,000 years ago figured out that your thoughts affect your brain and your brain affects your body. And now science has proven that. And for me, when I saw that, it all came together. I said, okay, the scientists have proven that the way we think about an experiment changes the experiment. And the theologists said it a long time ago, the theologians said a long time ago, that when we think differently, life behaves differently. And so for me, that was the grand unifying kind of thing, Jess, that brought it all together. It's like, okay, it's actually true that science keeps proving things that the Bible said a long time ago. And if something keeps turning out to be true over and over and over, then at some point a good scientist will say, well, maybe it's true because it's actually just true. And maybe it's just not some kind of trick or some coincidence, but if it keeps happening, I keep peeling the layers and it gets more and more complex and more sort of confirmatory of things that scripture said a long time ago, then maybe the ultimate explanation is that God was telling the truth when what he wrote down a long time ago turns out to be verifiable in science. Maybe it's because it's true.
I love that. That's beautiful. It gives people a lot to think about. I love the whole thing about quantum physics and faith. I think that would be a great conversation to have sometime, but we can leave that for another day. Before we wrap up, I want people to know where they can find you. I know you're on Dr. Lee Ward on Instagram, you're on X, you're on Facebook. I'm going to hold up your book right here. If people are watching, it's Hope is the First Dose is the fourth book. And you have a great podcast as well, and you're on Substack. So you're a lot of places. I'll link all of those things in the show notes. But if people are like, hey, I want to learn more about you, where's the best place to go?
I think probably Substack is the easiest way. drleewarren.substack.com is where my weekly newsletter and the podcast are all there. Now, I will mention that my Twitter was hacked. So Dr. Lee Warren on Twitter is some guy now who is selling cryptocurrency, and it's not me. Okay. So I've been working with Twitter to try to get my account back, but it's gone. So my handle on Twitter is not me. So don't go there looking for me. So.
All right. Well, we mentioned that. And so I wanted to ask you one final question, because I ask all my guests this like heartstrong question, and it's this. What is one thing about yourself what is one thing that you love about yourself because of the hardships or disappointments that you face? Like something that you can say, I really have come to love this about myself because it's been built through adversity.
It's hard to, you always feel less than humble when you say that, but it's God said it. He said, hey, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we're supposed to love ourselves. And I think the one thing that I've come to appreciate and love about how God put me together is that I never let adversity make me give up and walk away, that I've always found a way to stay on the field and keep fighting the fight. And so through all these hard things that I've been through, now I see them as kind of missional to help other people find their way forward. And I'm sure you've had that same experience, but somebody will reach out and say, gosh, that podcast you did, kind of really resurrected me. I was thinking about committing suicide, or I was thinking about, going back on to alcohol, and you kind of helped me through that. And so I love that adversity has refined me and not defined me.
I love that. That's beautiful. Well, thank you, Dr. Warren, for your time. This is an incredible conversation. I loved it. I think it's going to serve so many people, and the work you're doing in this world is really, really profound and really changing people's lives. So thanks for being you.
Thank you, Jess. It's an honor to be with you. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Heartstrong. I hope you found today's episode inspiring and applicable to your life. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Before I go, this is just a quick reminder that I believe in you, and I believe that you too have the ability to become heartstrong. I'll chat with you soon.